In 1990, in the dark alleys of Dallas, Texas, a serial murderer preyed on the women of the night.
He believes that all women are evil, that all women are bitches, whores, and sluts.
You better step back. I'm getting ready to knock you. Get away.
He was not the serial killer that you read about.
He knew what he was doing.
She immediately said, I hate hoes. I'm gonna kill all you hoes. Would you like some company?
Yeah.
All police knew was that the killer had a fascination with eyes. The eyes of his victims were his trophies. Dallas, Texas, known locally as the Big D, and with good reason. The skyscrapers of downtown Dallas form the hub of the Texas economy, the 11th largest in the world. There's no shortage of wealth in Dallas, and for those in the money, it's considered the place to be. But not everyone has been caught up in the boom. In the shadows of the Dallas skyscrapers are places where the not-so-fortunate do whatever's necessary to survive. One such area in southern Dallas is known as Oak Cliff, a place where abandoned properties serve as homes and where iron bars protect the homes of some of the more fortunate who live nearby. Gangs, drugs, and prostitution are rampant. Sergeant Regina Smith was a patrol officer in Oak Cliff.
This was the roughest section of town because, again, we had a varied community. We had the Hispanic community, the black community, and it was a lower income area. It was a high crime area.
In 1990, Oak Cliff prostitutes were a regular sight on almost every street corner. And they, like the rest of Oak Cliff, had seen better times.
These were not high-dollar escorts. These were drug addicts, sexually abused women who would do flatbacks, which is their phrase for straight sex, for $25, enough to get a hit of crack, which was big back in that era. And then as soon as they got high and the high came down, they would get back on the street to do another flatback. It was a miserable, dirty profession.
The so-called whore hotels of the area did a big business. Through bulletproof windows, prostitutes and their clients would pay by the hour to use dirty, flea-bitten rooms to turn tricks. Hundreds of women of all ages, backgrounds, and races, and almost all addicted to drugs, worked the streets of Oak Cliff, got arrested, got released, and went back to working the streets again. It was a rough, squalid life. A life in which violence was an occupational hazard.
In that world, prostitutes always talked about a client jumping bad on them. And that was when they would get assaulted. It was just part of the business. The Johns that came through were from the same sort of socioeconomic world as they were.
In 1990, it was particularly violent. Dallas had a record number of murders, an average of almost 2 a day, making it, at the time, one of the most dangerous cities in America. On the night of December 13th, 1990, 33-year-old Mary Pratt, an Oak Cliff prostitute, became the latest victim. She was found sprawled on a street in the city's south suburbs, dead from a .44 caliber bullet wound to the back of the head.
Mary Pratt was found in the middle of the street, almost totally disrobed. She did have some type of a blouse pulled up above her breast. She was, to us, she was displayed. The killer wanted us to see her in that position.
She was splayed out, and to most trained police officers, this is sending a message, look what I did.
The only lead in the case was a neighbor who said that shortly before dawn, she heard a car door slam shut and then the car drive away. Street prostitutes would meet with 10 to 20 men a day, which meant a huge pool of potential suspects.
It was clear that she had been murdered somewhere else and dumped here. There's very little physical evidence, no eyewitnesses.
The autopsy was performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Elizabeth Peacock.
Dallas had over 500 homicides in that year alone, so it was just another one of many homicides.
The track marks on the victim's arm told Dr. Peacock she was dealing with a drug addict, not unusual among prostitutes. But what she found next was unlike anything she'd seen before.
Everything was routine about that case until I went to examine her eye color.
She opened one eye, and then she opened another eye, and there was this infinitely long silence. And she finally said, "My God, the eyeballs are gone."
I would say that there had to be some skill involved. There was no disruption of the eyelids overlying the eye sockets.
This was not an operation you learn in medical school. The eyeballs were cut so precisely that they had to get the knife underneath the eyelid and then cut the 6 major muscle groups that connected the eyeball to the socket, and then shut the eyes in such a way that you couldn't even tell there was scarring around those eyes. She was so dumbfounded at what she saw because there was nothing in a textbook that even showed anything like this.
A rape kit done on Mary Pratt found no semen. Some foreign hairs were found on her body, but there were no other clues except for the extreme violence of the crime.
The killer who did this, or killers who did this, at least in their mind, had a high degree of intelligence. And they're very dangerous people, very dangerous people.
2 months later, police had another victim, 27-year-old Susan Peterson. She, too, was an Oak Cliff prostitute.
She was one of the most beautiful white prostitutes in that world, and she was tough. She cussed out clients. She didn't let anybody mess with her. She even cussed out the cops that wandered that neighborhood. She was a rugged, fierce woman.
Peterson had been shot 3 times with a .44 caliber pistol in the back of her head. An empty condom package was found near the body. Questions about whether these 2 murders were related were answered at the autopsy.
Dr. Peacock gets to the eyeballs and opens them up and gasps. She's the first one to realize that a serial killer is on the loose.
I kind of got a little bit of a chill on the back of my neck. I felt like the hair on the back of my neck stood up a little bit.
Again, no semen or other biological material was found. Before Susan Peterson turned to prostitution, she was an ensign in the U.S. Navy. Her military experience made her more street savvy than the other prostitutes.
I knew, number one, that she had to have known him in order to get in the car with him, because she knew that there was a killer out there. The last words that she told me was, "I hope you find whoever killed Mary."
Inevitably, police speculated, who would want to cut out a woman's eyes, and why?
In this case, you had power exhibited over the victims. You certainly had anger exhibited by their murders and also by the removal of the eyes. So power and anger, or a combination of the two, are the motivation for sexual crimes. These were sexual crimes. There's no question about that. But the motivation was not sex itself.
Dallas police were convinced that this killer would strike again. In 1991, Dallas police were looking for a deranged serial killer. 2 prostitutes, Mary Pratt and Susan Peterson, had been shot to death with a .44 caliber pistol, and then, for some reason known only to the killer, had their eyes surgically removed.
It was very different than what I had dealt with in the past. I'd never seen that before. I'd investigated a lot of homicides, and we knew we had some kind of psycho on our hand that was killing and mutilating these women.
It was a sheer sense of panic on the street. Now, for the white prostitutes. The black prostitutes at the time thought they were okay. They thought that he was just killing the white prostitutes, so they were still out there working full force.
Dallas officials called the FBI in Washington, D.C. They ran a check on their database, the world's most extensive source of information on violent offenders, and found no record of a killer surgically removing the eyes of his victims. The FBI created a behavioral profile of the Dallas killer. Such a profile is part science, part intuition. Using information gathered from the crime scenes and criminal histories, profilers try to identify important characteristics about the killer. Roy Hazelwood is a profiler who examined thousands of cases in his career with the FBI.
Sexual sadists believe that all women, heterosexual sadists, believe that all women are bitches, whores, and sluts. That includes his mother, his grandmother, his wife, his girlfriends.
But that wasn't all. The way the killer displayed the bodies was intended to send a message.
These were the killer's trophies, and he displayed them on the side of the road where all could see. He didn't try to hide the bodies. He didn't try to hide his handiwork. He was very proud of his handiwork.
The profile suggested that the perpetrator was a white male in his mid-30s, possibly a resident of Oak Cliff, with an educational background in the sciences. The FBI predicted he would be respected by those who knew him, would be physically fit, probably had friends in law enforcement, and was driving an older model pickup truck. They also predicted he would strike again.
I think that the killer was reacting with, I'll use a term that's probably inappropriate, glee, extremely happy at the amount of attention that's being generated by his crime. I think he had a sense of power that was being satisfied with this attention. He held the community, he himself, held the community in fear.
Flyers were posted throughout the city telling women to be on the lookout. The public was informed, but not told everything.
You don't want to scare the public. I mean, you have to notify them, you have to let them know what's going on, but you don't want to terrify the city of Dallas and say, we have an eyeball killer out there.
They never mentioned that there was any kind of eyeball removal. But what happened was that some detective leaked to a reporter that there was a significant facial mutilation. That was the phrase. And that was enough to send this story careening through the media locally. So that soon there was this kind of Jack the Ripper mentality going on. It was instant how quickly the media frenzy developed.
Police staked out motels in the Oak Cliff area and checked the license plates of the men who frequented the area. Female officers who fit what appeared to be the killer's taste dressed as prostitutes in an attempt to lure him in. But this turned up nothing. Then, a break. An Oak Cliff prostitute, Veronica Rodriguez, came forward saying she was with Mary Pratt on the night she was killed.
Veronica stated that she and Mary Pratt had a threesome with the killer. She stated that he took them out into a vacant field and they did their job on him. Both of them did.
But after the trick, something went wrong. As Veronica was getting dressed, Mary Pratt got into an argument with the customer.
You whores! You all should die!
And she watched in horror as Mary Pratt was shot in the head. Veronica Rodriguez said she ran through the field to a nearby home. Veronica described the attacker as a middle-aged white male with salt and pepper hair who was driving a white pickup truck. It was quite a story, one police were hesitant to believe.
Veronica Rodriguez was the classic crack-addicted prostitute. She had done drugs for so long that the cops used to say that her brain was fried. She was a notorious liar, or she went off into these kind of dementia-like statements that no one could understand.
There were times when she was lucid, but 90% of the time she was just doped up out of her mind.
Since police didn't believe Veronica's story, the case stalled. On March 10th, 1991, police had a third victim. This time, displayed directly in front of an elementary school. Again, a condom package was found next to the body. The victim was identified as 41-year-old Shirley Williams, a crack cocaine addict who worked as a maid by day and a prostitute by night. But this victim was black. The first two were white, and the body was found miles away from the others. Was this murder the work of the serial killer?
John Westphalen got the call. He rushed out there and said, well, the first thing I want you to do is open her eyeballs.
Shirley Williams' eyes had been removed. The serial killer was back at work. But in this case, the removal was not done with the same surgical precision as the first two cases.
There were some extra cuts on the upper face adjacent to the eyes, and in one of those cuts, we actually found the tip of an X-Acto knife where it had hit the bone, the upper part of the cheekbone just below the eye, which would not be a cut that you would make purposefully.
No biological material was found on the body, but several foreign pubic hairs were recovered. To profilers like Roy Hazelwood, the switch in race was troubling.
It's rare for a white offender to jump the racial barrier. As to specifics as to why a particular offender would do so, I can't answer that question. I don't know anyone else who can. Also, in keeping with my education and my experience, I know it's not unusual at all for a black offender to commit cross-racial offenses, sexual offenses.
This meant the potential pool of suspects included virtually all young to middle-aged males in the Dallas area. And police had no significant leads. In a city the size of Dallas, Texas, murder is not an uncommon occurrence. But serial killers aren't common, and someone who kills with the brutality of these cases was even more unusual.
My 30 years with the Dallas Police Department, I've never worked a case like this. And the removal of the eyes and the aggressiveness of the killer, I've never seen anything like this.
After the third murder, there was sheer hysteria on the streets. The prostitutes were scared. They wanted immediate action from the police. They wanted to work with the police as much as they could. And it set a wave of panic, not only on the streets, but throughout the entire city.
Research shows that signature killers work from a script and engage in repetitive behavior to the point of obsessiveness. Their calling cards at the crime scenes, how they choose their victims, control their victims, display or mutilate the bodies, all reveal their pathological deviance. These killers will often take mementos from their victims, which they use to reinvigorate their excitement. When that excitement subsides over time, they go hunting again. Sergeant Smith was convinced that the perpetrator was a regular customer of the Oak Cliff prostitutes and interviewed as many as she could to gather information. One was Brenda White. At 17 years old, already a veteran prostitute. White said she once had a run-in with a customer who matched the description of the perpetrator.
Brenda got into the car with the suspect, and the suspect did not want to do what Brenda normally did on her tricks. She wanted to go to a hotel, and the suspect wanted to just drive around. And she told him, no, we're not having that, basically.
You can stay.
And that is when the suspect began attacking her, trying to choke her. He was saying, I hate hoes. I'm gonna kill all you hoes. And she said, oh, you're a damn lie. And she pulled out her mace and she maced him and was able to get out of that car. She ran for her life. And Brenda remembered every detail of the suspect's face.
Brenda White said her attacker was a well-built, middle-aged white male with salt and pepper hair. This description was similar to the one provided by Veronica Rodriguez, the prostitute who said she witnessed Mary Pratt's murder. Veronica said after Pratt's murder, she ran to a nearby home for assistance.
Somebody got murdered out there.
Please, calm down, calm down.
The resident was Axton Schindler, a truck driver. According to Veronica, Schindler told her that he knew the man who was stalking the prostitutes. During police questioning, Schindler denied this. On a hunch, Sergeant Smith decided to investigate Schindler's background. Schindler did not have a prior criminal history, but the address on Schindler's driver's license did not match the address where he was living. His driver's license listed his address as 1035 El Dorado Street.
I entered the address of 1035 El Dorado in the computer. The owners of the property was a Charles Albright and a Fred Albright.
Sergeant Smith wrote those names on a piece of paper and walked by the desk of Constable Walter Cook.
And I hear Walter on the phone, and he is saying 1035 El Dorado and Albright. I look and I said, what is that? And he puts the phone, he goes, it's a confidential informant. She says she thinks she knows who this killer is, and he has a fetish for X-Acto knives.
The informant identified the man as 57-year-old Charles Albright.
She had dated this guy prior, some time back, and she remembered him, there's something about some eyes that he said he just had a feeling for eyes. But she never say, why but she did mention one thing, that he had a bunch of X-Acto knives up in his attic.
When they brought the photograph to me, I completely got a chill down my spine. He fit the description exactly.
Albright had a past criminal history of burglary, theft, and sexual assault on an underage girl. When Brenda White was shown Albright's photograph, she immediately identified him as her attacker. Next, it was Veronica Rodriguez's turn. She was brought into police headquarters and shown 6 photographs. She was then asked if she recognized any of them.
And she goes from the first picture to the second picture to the third picture, which is Albright's picture. And she bursts into tears. She will not say a thing. She begins to shake.
She was terrified. She was screaming. She was shaking. She was physically terrified just seeing the picture of this man.
Finally, Veronica Rodriguez took the photo of Charles Albright, turned it over, and signed her name to it. The first positive identification of the killer. After 3 Dallas prostitutes were found murdered with their eyes surgically removed, police finally had a suspect in 57-year-old Charles Albright. Except for his age, Albright fit the FBI's psychological profile. Divorced with 1 child, he and his common-law wife, Dixie Austin, lived in South Dallas, just a few miles away from the red light district where the victims once worked. Albright also owned a rental property near where 2 of the victims had been dumped. Police thought Albright might be their man, but Veronica Rodriguez was the only person who could tie him directly to the murders, and that was a problem.
Now think about this. Here was a woman who was totally crack addicted. She was almost at a state of near dementia when she would use drugs. She was a notorious liar to begin with, and yet she's the one who saw Charlie Albright with a gun trying to kill her. And she is the one eyewitness the cops had.
Police looked for anyone else who could identify Albright and showed his picture to prostitutes all over Dallas.
We wanted to establish him as a person going to these motels and to find out if the prostitutes knew him. And we did that. We showed photographs to several different prostitutes, and a lot of them did identify him as being in the area and picking up different women.
All of them point to Charlie Albright and say he's here all the time. Some of them knew him as Mr. Albright. Some of them knew him as Pappy. Some of them knew him as Old Man. But there he was, and so they had this connection.
Yeah, get in. I know everything now.
He hired two prostitutes on one occasion, tied them down, beat them with belts, etc., ropes and belts, and then said, "Scream, bitch, scream. You know you love it." Well, that certainly smacks of sexual sadism to me. He was also a masochist. He enjoyed being mistreated himself. So he was a sadomasochist. A combination of the two deviations in one personality.
Although the prostitutes knew Albright, he denied it, saying he had never been with a prostitute in his life. When police searched Albright's truck, they found foreign hairs, but no blood, tissue, or other biological evidence. In his living room, hidden in a mantelpiece, they found a collection of guns, but not the .44 caliber pistol used in the murders. They did, however, find .44 caliber ammunition. In a drawer, they found a large collection of X-Acto knives. In another, they discovered the same brand of condoms found with two of the bodies. But none of this tied him directly to the murders.
They went through the house 6 or 7 times. They brought in FBI machinery that could look through walls. They were thinking they were going to find even the eyeballs somewhere, because that was always the question. What did this killer do with the eyeballs? They found nothing. They didn't find a gun. They didn't find blood.
Next, police got a tip from an Oak Cliff prostitute, Tina Conley. Tina said she was working the streets with Shirley Williams on the night she was murdered. It was raining hard, and Tina decided to go home. Shirley needed the money and decided to stay out. Despite the rain, customers were still cruising the area. Before Tina left, she loaned Shirley Williams her yellow raincoat. Later, Tina saw Shirley get into a white pickup truck. Shirley Williams' body was found the next day, displayed in front of an elementary school. But investigators knew she had been killed elsewhere. Tina Conley showed police the field where Shirley Williams took all her clients. And in the brush was the yellow raincoat. Was it possible that the raincoat contained evidence about the murder? In the forensics lab, investigators found Shirley Williams' blood on the raincoat, and they scraped it for hair, fibers, grass, and pollen samples. On the raincoat, scientists found one peculiar hair. It was so unusual, forensic experts could not immediately identify it. The outer layer of human hair is a series of separate overlapping scales, like the tiles on a roof. But the outer layer of this hair was different. The scale pattern was a mosaic, and the inner core, the medulla, was much larger than in human hair. Scientists compared it to known samples from a dog, a deer, a rabbit, a cat, and a mouse, with no luck. In all of their years of experience, the scientists had never seen a hair like it. They could find no similar hairs in their textbooks, but they widened their search and found a match.
And I'll tell you, it took the forensic criminologists over a week to determine what it was. It was a squirrel tail hair, not a squirrel nose hair or a squirrel paw hair, a squirrel tail hair.
Scientists then analyzed the vacuum cleaner bag confiscated during the search of Charles Albright's home. In the bag were numerous hairs and fibers. Although some of the hairs appeared to be similar to Shirley Williams, a so-called hair match is not possible. On the left, a pubic hair found on Shirley Williams' body. On the right, Albright's pubic hair.
It's possible that two hairs that are so nearly alike they can't be distinguished microscopically could come from two separate individuals.
After hours of searching Albright's vacuum cleaner bag, they found one hair that was not human. It was identified as a squirrel hair, specifically a squirrel tail hair. It was microscopically similar to the squirrel tail hair found on Shirley Williams' raincoat.
I can't tell you it came from the same squirrel, but I got to tell you, probably none of us, none of your viewers right now have squirrel tail hairs in their vacuum cleaner bags as we're talking. That was a tremendous piece of circumstantial evidence which tended to link him to that particular victim.
Journalist Skip Hollinsworth looked into Albright's past and uncovered some interesting details. Charles Albright was a part-time carpenter. He held no full-time job and lived off a $96,000 inheritance from his parents. Albright had an unusual upbringing. He was adopted and grew up believing his birth mother was a prostitute. He was the only child of his adopted mother, Dell.
Charlie grew up with a very protective, loving, but maybe overtly motherly mother. Dell Albright was always trying to make sure Charlie felt protected. She kept goats out in the backyard so that he would have pure goat's milk to drink.
His adoptive mother kept Charlie busy. He became an accomplished pianist and painter and developed a passion for taxidermy. Charles and his mother would stuff birds and other animals, and by all accounts, Albright would spend hours perfecting his work. But money was short, and there were some items Dell couldn't afford.
Dell was too cheap to buy the expensive glass eyeballs, so she gave Charlie little black sewing buttons to put into the eyes of these birds and squirrels.
Was this the start of a fatal obsession? In college, there was another story about Albright's fascination with eyes. When Charlie's best friend broke up with his girlfriend, he threw all of her photographs in the trash. Albright pulled them from the trash, cut out the eyes in each picture, and pasted them all over his best friend's dorm room.
In my opinion, this all goes back to his desire to make a woman perfect. He obviously felt they were more beautiful without the eyes.
Was it possible that Albright's background as a taxidermist provided the skills he needed to remove his victim's eyes?
Charles Albright was not a major offender. I recall that he had an arrest for shoplifting and another arrest for sexual assault of a child, which is major. But that in itself does not necessarily mean that he's the killer.
One of Albright's prior offenses involved a scam at Crandall High School outside of Dallas. Using forged college transcripts, Albright got a job there as a biology teacher and football coach. He was immensely popular and respected until his scam was exposed. He received a year's probation. But the background in science was consistent with the FBI's psychological profile of the killer. So was the fact that he drove a white pickup truck and was physically fit. The profile said he would also have friends in law enforcement. Albright regularly played softball with Dr. Irv Stone, head of the Dallas County Forensic Science Unit.
Charlie expressed in a number of instances with regard to some case that was in the newspaper, a homicide or whatever, an autopsy that was made. He would ask me questions about different muscles of the body or different procedures used at autopsy, so it was pretty clear to me, I believe, that he was really an intelligent fellow with more than the average knowledge of things relating to anatomy and physiology.
He loved this group of men. They were a good softball team. They played all the time. And after one game, a car drove by with two young women in it who sort of waved and tried to beckon the men over. And at that time, Charlie was single, and one of the men said, "Hey, Charlie, you're single. Why don't you go over there and talk to him?" And this look came across Charlie's face, and he said, "I can tell they're whores. I know they're whores. I'd like to kill them all."
Charles Albright was arrested and charged with Shirley Williams' murder, since it was the only one of the three in which they had sufficient evidence.
Do you have any idea why they're accusing you?
No, sir, I don't.
Albright contended that his tenant, Axton Schindler, was the real killer, but the prostitutes identified Albright as the man who attacked them, not Schindler. And Schindler's hairs were very different than those found on the victims. On the left is Albright's hair. On the right is Schindler's. They're not even remotely similar. And it was a conversation with police that betrayed Albright's story.
He looked at us and said, "I've never been with a prostitute in my life." And that was almost as good as a confession, because with all of the human hair that we had cross-matched, his hair on the prostitute's body, the prostitute's hair in his house, we proved without a doubt that he had been with prostitutes. If he would have stepped up and said, "Well, sure, I've been with prostitutes before," that could have explained the hair.
Prosecutors believe that it was Charles Albright who picked up Shirley Williams that night. After the rain stopped, they went to the field where Williams took all her clients. Albright threw his jacket onto the ground next to Williams' raincoat, where both came into contact with the squirrel hair. After sex, Albright shot Williams in the head with a .44 caliber pistol. Then, he proceeded to remove her eyes. But something happened. He was rushed this time and didn't remove the eyes with the same care he had in the earlier cases. After he wrapped the body to transport it to the elementary school, he grabbed his coat but left Williams' raincoat behind. The squirrel hair from Albright's coat eventually made its way onto the floor of his home. Sometime later, when Albright cleaned his floor, the squirrel hair was picked up by the vacuum cleaner, where it was found by police. The squirrel hair in Albright's vacuum cleaner bag was similar to the squirrel hair found on Williams' raincoat at the murder scene. Charles Albright admits he's fascinated with eyes, but says that doesn't make him a killer.
I got 3 books that gave reference to taking out eyes. One of them, Stephen King. This gypsy had a little tiny spoon for removing eyeballs in a book called Thinner. Then there was another reference in a book called Mine about if this woman catches me and this woman had her baby, says I'll pull her eyes out and stuff them down her throat.
Why would such a kindly, lighthearted man want to remove the eyeballs of a prostitute? You know, was it because his birth mother really was a prostitute? Was it out of some kind of strange, twisted sexual fantasy? You know, did he need some kind of trophy?
I think he enjoyed inflicting terror and pain on people. I think he enjoyed the chase. I think he enjoyed the sexual pleasure he got from these women.
The squirrel hair found in Albright's vacuum cleaner and his head and pubic hair found on Williams' body was the only forensic evidence against him. Dan Haygood stood before the jury and presented the closing argument against Charles Albright. He still remembers the family of Shirley Williams sitting in the front row.
Their eyes were closed, their hands were held together, all 3 had their hands held, and they were whispering, "Praise Jesus, praise Jesus, praise Jesus," just as fast as their mouths would move. And it just tore me up. I said, "Look at this family." I said, "Look at this family, and I want you to go home and sleep like a baby and give this man life." And I sat down. And to this day, it still bothers me. I can still see the image of that family in my head. When I tell a story, I still get choked up over it. And they jury gave him life in about 3 minutes.
Despite the conviction, Charles Albright continues to maintain his innocence. Coincidentally, Since Albright's incarceration, the murders in Oak Cliff have stopped, and the amount of street prostitution has also diminished.
One of the reasons I left the DA's office is because of the effect these cases have on me. And this particular case was gut-wrenching. These victims were the outcasts of society. Nobody was around to love them. Nobody was around to care for them. And they died horrible deaths.
Shortly after his conviction, Albright sent away for a copy of a vintage magazine. He wanted the premiere issue of Omni. Its cover story held something of interest.